Lance Corporal Heinrich Krüger had prepared himself for hatred, for stones thrown by angry hands, for the spitting contempt of a nation whose sons he had once fought against. What he never expected, as he was marched past that Colorado schoolyard in 1944, was for a group of American children to point at a soccer ball and shout with genuine excitement, "Do you want to play?" That single moment would shatter everything he thought he knew about enemies and friendship, about war and humanity, and about the invisible threads that connect us all. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Greeley, Colorado, as the transport truck rumbled to a stop outside Camp Carson's temporary holding facility. Heinrich Krüger pressed his face against the metal slats, watching the American landscape roll by with a mixture of curiosity and dread. The Rocky Mountains loomed in the distance, their snow-capped peaks a stark reminder of how far he was from the rolling hills of Bavaria he called home. Heinrich had been captured 3 months earlier during the Battle of the Bulge, his unit overwhelmed by Allied forces in what would become Germany's last major offensive of the war. At 22, he had already seen more death and destruction than most men witness in a lifetime. The optimistic young man who had enlisted believing in glory and honor had been replaced by someone who understood that war was nothing more than organized suffering, dressed up in noble words. The truck's engine coughed and died, and Heinrich heard the familiar bark of American guards shouting orders. His fellow prisoners, 12 men in total, began to stir from their exhausted stupor. They had been traveling for 2 days, transferred from a facility in Kansas to this new camp in Colorado. Rumors had circulated among the prisoners about what awaited them here, some claiming the Americans were decent captors who followed the Geneva Convention, others whispering darker stories about revenge and retribution. Raus, raus. The guard's attempted German was heavily accented but unmistakable. Heinrich and his fellow prisoners filed out of the truck, blinking in the bright Colorado sunshine. The air here was thinner than what Heinrich was accustomed to, carrying the crisp bite of mountain altitude and the sweet scent of prairie grass. As they formed a loose column for the march to the main camp, Heinrich noticed they were passing through what appeared to be a residential area. Modest houses lined the street, their front yards showing the first signs of spring growth. Laundry hung from clotheslines, and the normalcy of it all struck him as surreal. Here was life continuing, as if the world wasn't tearing itself apart across 2 oceans. The lead guard, a stocky sergeant with kind eyes, gestured for the prisoners to move forward. "Stay together, boys. It's just a short walk." His tone was neither cruel nor particularly friendly, simply professional. Heinrich had learned to appreciate such neutrality from his captors. It was far preferable to the seething hatred he had expected. They had walked perhaps 2 blocks when Heinrich heard it, the sound that would forever change his understanding of what it meant to be human. Children's laughter, high and clear, carried on the afternoon breeze. At first, it seemed impossibly distant, like an echo from a life he had almost forgotten existed. Then, as they rounded a corner, the source became visible. A small schoolyard stretched before them, separated from the street by a chain-link fence, topped not with barbed wire, but with nothing more threatening than a few morning glory vines beginning to show their first spring buds. Inside the yard, perhaps 20 children were engaged in recess, their ages appearing to range from 6 to 12. Some were playing on swings, others had organized an impromptu game of tag, but Heinrich's attention was immediately drawn to a group of 8 boys who had formed a rough circle around a worn leather soccer ball. The ball itself was clearly well loved, its surface scuffed and patched in several places. One of the boys, a freckled redhead who couldn't have been more than 10, was attempting to juggle the ball with his feet, his tongue poking out in concentration as he tried to maintain control. His friends cheered each successful touch and groaned dramatically when the ball inevitably hit the ground. Heinrich felt something twist in his chest as he watched. The scene was so achingly familiar, so reminiscent of his own childhood in Munich, where he and his friends had spent countless hours in similar pursuits. They had used whatever they could find for a ball, sometimes rolled up socks, or even a tin can when nothing else was available. The pure joy of the game had been the same, though. That universal language of children at play that transcended nationality, language, or circumstance. The prisoners' column had slowed as they passed the school, perhaps because the guards, too, were momentarily captivated by the innocent scene unfolding beyond the fence. It was then that disaster struck for the young redhead. His ambitious attempt at a particularly complex juggling move sent the ball sailing over his head and directly toward the fence. The ball struck the chain link with a metallic rattle and bounced back into the yard, but not before every child in the immediate vicinity had turned to look at the unusual procession passing on the street. Heinrich's heart began to race, his muscles tensing for the inevitable confrontation. This was the moment he had dreaded, when the reality of what he represented, the enemy, would collide with the innocence of American children. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Heinrich could see the children taking in the sight of the 12 men in their faded Wehrmacht uniforms, now stripped of insignia but still clearly marking them as German soldiers. He waited for the screaming to begin, for small hands to grab stones from the playground, for voices raised in the kind of hatred that war breeds in even the youngest hearts. Instead, the freckled boy who had lost control of the ball took a step toward the fence. His friends clustered behind him, but Heinrich could see no fear in their faces, only curiosity. The boy pointed directly at Heinrich, who happened to be closest to the fence, and called out in a voice clear with excitement, "Hey, mister, do you want to play?" The words hit Heinrich like a physical blow, so unexpected and foreign to everything he had prepared himself for, but he actually stumbled slightly, catching himself with a hand against the fence. Behind him, he heard one of his fellow prisoners, Franz Müller from Hamburg, let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "What did he say?" whispered Klaus Weber, a farmer from the Rhineland whose English was limited. "He asked if we want to play," Heinrich replied in German, his voice barely audible. The American sergeant had stopped the column entirely now, apparently as surprised by this development as the prisoners themselves. He looked from the children to the Germans and back again, clearly trying to determine the appropriate response to a situation not covered in any manual. The red-headed boy was undeterred by the lack of immediate response. He picked up the soccer ball and held it against the fence, his small fingers poking through the chain links. "Soccer," he said, pronouncing the word carefully. "Do you know soccer?" Heinrich found himself walking toward the fence without conscious decision, drawn by something he couldn't name. The guard made no move to stop him, perhaps sensing that whatever was happening here was beyond the usual protocols of war and captivity. "Football," Heinrich said softly, using the word he had grown up with. "We call it football." The boy's face lit up with understanding and delight. "You do know it. Are you good? Can you teach us some tricks?" Behind the first boy, others were gathering, their young faces bright with interest. Heinrich could see adults in the distance, teachers or supervisors, moving closer to investigate the unusual interaction, but they hadn't intervened yet. Heinrich began, then found himself switching to English, drawing on lessons from school that seemed like a lifetime ago. "I played, yes, when I was boy like you." This admission seemed to break whatever Gam had been holding back the children's enthusiasm. They pressed against the fence from their side, while Heinrich stood on his, the metal links the only thing separating former enemies who had found common ground in the universal language of sport. "What's your name?" asked a dark-haired girl who had joined the group. "Heinrich," he replied, then added, "Henry," in English. "I'm Billy," said the redhead. "This is Susan, and that's Joe, and Mickey, and—" The introductions continued as more children gathered, their names washing over Heinrich in a wave of American normalcy that felt like stepping into a different world entirely. The American sergeant approached Heinrich from behind, his voice low but not unkind. "I don't see any harm in it, soldier, but we do need to keep moving soon." Heinrich nodded, understanding the position the man was in. Rules were rules, and prisoners of war had schedules to maintain. But then Billy spoke up again. "Could he just kick the ball with us? Just once? Please, mister?" The boy was addressing the sergeant now, his voice taking on the wheedling tone that children master early in life. The sergeant looked around, taking in the scene. Other prisoners had moved closer to the fence as well, drawn by the unexpected warmth of the interaction. Some of the German soldiers were attempting their own broken English conversations with the children, who seemed delighted to serve as impromptu language teachers. 5 minutes, the sergeant said finally. But that's all. The cheer that went up from the children was infectious, and Heinrich found himself smiling for the first time in months. Billy immediately began working to find a section of fence low enough to roll the ball under, while his friends scattered to create space for an impromptu game. What followed was unlike anything Heinrich had experienced during his months of captivity. With the ball successfully transferred to the street side of the fence, Billy called out basic instructions for their makeshift game. "Just try to keep it in the air," he shouted. "We'll count how many times we can touch it without it hitting the ground." Heinrich's muscle memory took over as the ball came his way. Without thinking, he trapped it with his instep, popped it up to his knee, then back to his foot, keeping it airborne with the skill that came from years of practice. The children erupted in cheers and applause, their excitement genuine and infectious. "Wow, you're really good," Billy called out, his voice filled with admiration, rather than the suspicion Heinrich had expected. The ball continued to circulate among the impromptu group, children and German soldiers working together to keep it aloft. Heinrich found himself laughing, actually laughing, as young Joe attempted an overly ambitious header that sent the ball flying in completely the wrong direction. The boy's theatrical dismay at his failure was so genuine and funny that even the other German prisoners began chuckling. Franz Müller, who had been a teacher before the war, was attempting to explain soccer terminology to Susan, using a combination of broken English and elaborate hand gestures that had both the girl and his Arabi fellow prisoners in stitches. Klaus Weber, despite his limited English, had somehow managed to communicate with Mickey about farming, and the two were engaged in what appeared to be a serious discussion about the best techniques for growing corn. As the impromptu game continued, Heinrich became aware that they were drawing an audience beyond the school children. Adults had begun to gather on both sides of the fence, some clearly teachers or school staff, others appearing to be parents or local residents who had been drawn by the unusual scene. Heinrich tensed slightly, waiting for the inevitable adult intervention that would end this moment of unexpected connection. Surely the adults would see the inappropriateness of American children fraternizing with enemy soldiers, regardless of how innocent the interaction might appear. But the adults who had gathered seemed as captivated by the scene as everyone else. Heinrich could see conversations happening among them, some pointing and clearly discussing the situation, but no one moved to break up the game. If anything, he sensed approval from several of the onlookers, nods and smiles that suggested they understood something important was happening here. A woman who appeared to be a teacher approached the fence from the school side. She was middle-aged, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and she carried herself with the authority that comes from years of managing classrooms full of energetic children. "Boys and girls," she called out, her voice carrying easily over the sounds of play, "remember that our new friends don't have very long to visit." Heinrich expected this to be the polite but firm end to their interaction, the adult voice of reason that would remind everyone of the realities of war and proper behavior. Instead, the teacher surprised him by addressing the German soldiers directly. "You boys play beautifully," she said, her English clear and deliberately simple. "These children will remember this day for a very long time." The warmth in her voice was unmistakable, and Heinrich felt something inside him crack open. This woman, who had every reason to view him as an enemy, was speaking to him with the same kindness she might show to any young man far from home. It was a kindness he hadn't experienced since before the war began, a reminder of the humanity that existed beyond the boundaries of nationality and conflict. The 5 minutes the sergeant had promised were clearly stretching longer, but the man made no move to end the interaction. Heinrich suspected that the guard, too, was moved by what he was witnessing. There was something profound happening here, something that transcended the usual categories of prisoner and captor, enemy and ally. As the ball came to Heinrich once again, he decided to show the children something special. Trapping the ball with his chest, He let it drop to his feet and began a series of moves he had learned as a teenager, tricks that had made him something of a local legend on the football pitches of Munich. He juggled the ball from foot to foot, then to his knees, his head, and back to his feet, all while moving in a small circle that kept the children riveted with attention. The performance concluded with Heinrich flicking the ball high into the air and catching it cleanly on the back of his neck, balancing it there for several seconds before letting it roll down his back and catching it on his heel. The children exploded in applause and cheers, their delight so pure and enthusiastic that Heinrich felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "That was incredible," Billy shouted, his young voice cracking with excitement. "Can you teach me how to do that?" Before Heinrich could respond, the sergeant finally stepped forward, his voice regretful but firm. "Time to go, boys. Sorry, kids, but we have a schedule to keep." The disappointment on the children's faces was immediate and heartbreaking, but they seemed to understand that this magical interlude had to come to an end. Billy quickly rolled the ball back under the fence, then pressed himself against the chain links. "Will you come back?" he asked Heinrich directly, his young face serious with hope. Heinrich looked to the sergeant, who shrugged. "The camp's not far from here. If there are work details in town, who knows?" "I hope so," Heinrich told Billy, meaning it more than he had meant anything in a very long time. "Maybe I can teach you those tricks." As the prisoners began to form up for the remainder of their march to the camp, the children pressed against the fence, calling out goodbyes and waves. Heinrich heard his name called out by several young voices, and he turned back to wave, struck by the surreal nature of the entire experience. "Thank you," called Susan, her voice clear and sweet. "That was the best recess ever." Other children echoed the sentiment, their farewells enthusiastic and genuine. Heinrich found himself walking backwards for several steps, reluctant to break eye contact with these children, who had shown him more kindness in 20 minutes than he had experienced in months of captivity. As they walked away from the school, Franz Müller moved up beside Heinrich, his expression thoughtful. "That was something I never expected to see," he said quietly in German. "None of us did," Heinrich replied, his voice still thick with emotion. Klaus Weber, walking just behind them, added his own observation. "Those children, they didn't see enemies, they just saw people who might want to play." The truth of that statement settled over the group of prisoners like a revelation. In the simple, uncomplicated worldview of children, the complex politics of war had no place. There were only people, and soccer balls, and the universal desire to play. The rest of the march to Camp Carson passed in relative quiet, each man lost in his own thoughts about what had just transpired. For Heinrich, the experience had cracked open something inside him that had been sealed shut since his capture, perhaps since the war began. It was the recognition that humanity persisted even in the darkest circumstances, that connection and kindness could spring up in the most unlikely places. When they finally reached the camp, with its familiar barbed wire and guard towers, Heinrich felt as though he was returning from a journey to another world rather than a simple 20-minute walk through a Colorado town. The reality of his situation hadn't changed. He was still a prisoner of war in a foreign country, thousands of miles from home, with no idea when or if he would see his family again. But something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what that situation meant. The processing into the new camp followed the routine Heinrich had become accustomed to. Paperwork, medical checks, assignment of bunk and work details, the mundane bureaucracy of organized captivity. But throughout the process, his mind kept returning to Billy's freckled face pressed against the fence, to the sound of children's laughter mixing with his fellow prisoners' voices, to the teacher who had called them boys rather than boya, enemies. That evening, as Heinrich lay on his narrow cot in the barracks he would share with 40 other German prisoners, he found himself staring at the ceiling and reliving every moment of the encounter. The other men in the barracks were engaged in their usual evening activities, writing letters home, playing cards, or simply trying to sleep away another day of captivity. But Heinrich was elsewhere, mentally replaying the sensation of the soccer ball against his feet, the weight of it familiar and comforting in a way that connected him to who he had been before the war. Franz Müller, whose cot was adjacent to Heinrich's, noticed his friend's distraction. "You're thinking about those children," he observed. "How could I not be?" Heinrich replied. "When was the last time someone was happy to see us? When was the last time anyone wanted us to stay rather than go away?" Franz nodded slowly. "It makes you wonder what we've been fighting for, doesn't it? Those children didn't care about politics or nationalism or any of it. They just wanted to play soccer." Their conversation was overheard by some of the other men, and soon a larger discussion had developed. Otto Brennan, a mechanic from Berlin, shared his own thoughts about the children's reaction. "My son is about the age of that red-haired boy," he said quietly. "I wonder if he would be as kind to American prisoners as those children were to us." "Children see things differently," offered Hermann Bach, an older man who had been a professor of philosophy before being conscripted. "They haven't learned to hate yet. They haven't been taught that nationality determines worth." The discussion continued late into the night, with men sharing their own memories of childhood, of games played in streets and fields that looked nothing like Colorado, but felt exactly the same. There was something healing in these conversations, a recognition that the war had not succeeded in completely erasing their humanity or their connection to the simple joys that had once defined their lives. Over the following days, Heinrich found himself assigned to a work detail that involved maintenance of local infrastructure. The prisoners would be bused to various locations around Greeley and the surrounding area, performing manual labor under the supervision of American guards. It was during one of these work assignments, 3 weeks after the encounter at the school, that Heinrich's world expanded once again. The detail had been assigned to repair a section of fence around the city park, work that required them to spend the entire day in full view of the local population. Heinrich had grown accustomed to the stares and whispers that typically accompanied such public work assignments. Most Americans simply ignored the prisoners, going about their daily business as if the Germans were invisible. Others would slow down to stare, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. It was mid-afternoon when Heinrich heard a familiar voice calling his name. Looking up from the fence post he was securing, he saw Billy running across the park toward him, his school books bouncing in a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. Behind him, at a more sedate pace, came several other children from the school encounter, including Susan and Joe. "Henry, it's really you," Billy called out as he approached, his face bright with excitement. "I knew it was you. I told everyone at school that I recognized your hair." Heinrich glanced nervously at the guard supervising their work detail, unsure of the protocol for this situation. The man, a corporal named Johnson, whom Heinrich had learned was from Iowa, seemed as surprised by the children's arrival as the prisoners were. "These kids friends of yours?" Johnson asked, his tone more curious than suspicious. "We met them few weeks ago," Heinrich explained, his English still heavily accented but improved from his practice with fellow prisoners. "At school. We played soccer." Johnson nodded, recognition dawning on his face. "Oh, you're the bunch from that day. I heard about that from Sergeant Martinez. Made quite an impression, apparently." Billy had reached the fence where the prisoners were working and was practically bouncing with excitement. "Henry, we've been practicing. Joe can do 3 juggles in a row now, and Susan learned how to do that thing where you stop the ball with the inside of your foot." The enthusiasm was infectious, and Heinrich found himself grinning despite the unusual nature of the situation. "That is very good," he said. "Practice makes perfect, yes? Will you show us more tricks?" asked Susan, who had caught up to Billy. "Please? We have our ball with us." Sure enough, Joe was carrying the same worn leather soccer ball from their original encounter. The sight of it brought back the flood of emotions from that day, the unexpected kindness, and the simple joy of shared play. Corporal Johnson looked around the park, noting that several adult residents had stopped to observe this reunion between the American children and the German prisoners. His expression was thoughtful as he weighed the situation. "I suppose you boys could take a break," he said finally. "But just for a few minutes, and don't wander off." What followed was a repeat of the magical encounter from weeks earlier, but this time in the open space of the city park rather than separated by a chain-link fence. The children had indeed been practicing, and their improvement was evident in their ball control and passing. Heinrich found himself serving as an impromptu coach, offering gentle corrections and encouragement as the group played an informal game of keep away. Other prisoners joined in as they became more comfortable with the situation, and soon there was a proper game in progress, with Germans and Americans mixed together on improvised teams. Franz Müller, who had played semi-professionally before the war, demonstrated some defensive techniques to Mickey, while Klaus Weber attempted to explain the offside rule to a confused but eager Joe. The game had attracted quite an audience. Part visitors had stopped their own activities to watch, and Heinrich could see that the crowd was mixed in its reactions. Some faces showed disapproval, clearly uncomfortable with the sight of American children playing alongside enemy prisoners. Others seemed charmed by the innocence of the scene, nodding approvingly at the children's unself-conscious kindness. It was during a particularly energetic scramble for the ball that Heinrich noticed a woman standing at the edge of the group of spectators. She was well-dressed, with carefully styled hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority or social prominence. Her expression was stern as she watched the interaction between the children and the prisoners, and Heinrich felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in his stomach. The woman stepped forward, and the quality of her movement suggested she was preparing to intervene in a way that would likely end this wonderful interlude. Heinrich tensed, ready to step back and remove himself from whatever confrontation was brewing. But before the woman could speak, Billy's mother appeared at her side. Heinrich recognized her from the original encounter at the school, where she had been among the parents who had gathered to watch. She was a small, energetic woman who carried herself with quiet confidence. "Isn't it wonderful, Mrs. Patterson?" Billy's mother said to the stern-faced woman. "Look how happy they all are. Billy hasn't stopped talking about these boys since they met at the school." Mrs. Patterson's expression didn't soften immediately. "I hardly think it's appropriate for our children to be socializing with enemy soldiers, Margaret. What kind of message does that send?" Margaret, Billy's mother, considered this for a moment before responding. "I think it sends the message that we're raising children who see people as people, regardless of what uniform they're wearing. Those boys are barely older than my brother was when he enlisted." The conversation continued, but Heinrich's attention was drawn back to the game when Billy called for him to demonstrate the neck catch trick again. As he performed the move, balancing the ball carefully before letting it roll down his back, he was aware that the adult conversation nearby had stopped, both women now watching his demonstration. When the trick concluded to enthusiastic applause from the children, Mrs. Patterson spoke again, but her tone had changed slightly. "I suppose they are quite young," she admitted. "And they're certainly skilled players." "They're just boys, Eleanor," Margaret replied gently. "Boys who are very far from home and probably miss their own families terribly." Heinrich felt a lump form in his throat at these words. The simple acknowledgement of his humanity, of the fact that he was more than just a uniform or a symbol of an enemy nation, meant more to him than he could express. Corporal Johnson eventually called time on the impromptu soccer clinic, but not before the children had extracted promises from Heinrich and the other prisoners to teach them more skills if they met again. As the work detail prepared to return to their fence repair duties, Billy approached Heinrich one last time. "Henry," the boy said seriously, "my mom says you probably miss your family. Do you have brothers and sisters?" The question was so innocent, so naturally human, that Heinrich had to swallow hard before responding. "I have sister," he managed. "She is your age, maybe a little older." "What's her name?" "Greta," Heinrich replied, his voice soft with memory. Billy nodded solemnly, as if filing away this important information. "I hope you get to see Greta soon. Maybe when the war is over, she can come visit America and we can all play soccer together." The naive optimism of the suggestion was heartbreaking in its innocence, but Heinrich managed to smile. "That would be very nice, Billy. Very nice indeed." As the children departed, calling out waves and promises to keep practicing, Heinrich returned to his work with a lightness in his step that had been absent for longer than he cared to remember. The simple human connection, the recognition of his individual humanity rather than his status as an enemy, had touched something deep inside him. The story of the German prisoners playing soccer with American children began to spread through Greeley and the surrounding communities. Some residents were indeed troubled by what they saw as inappropriate fraternization with the enemy, but many others were moved by the humanity displayed by all involved. Over the remaining months of the war, Heinrich and his fellow prisoners encountered the children several more times during work details in town. Each meeting was characterized by the same genuine warmth and enthusiasm, the same uncomplicated joy and shared play that had marked their first encounter. The children's parents, initially perhaps uncertain about their offspring's attachment to enemy soldiers, gradually came to see the interactions as evidence of their children's fundamental decency and inability to hate. Several parents began to attend these impromptu games, not to supervise or intervene, but simply to witness the proof that human connection could transcend the artificial barriers of war. As spring turned to summer and summer to autumn, the regular soccer games became something of a local institution. The children's skills improved dramatically under the tutelage of players who had learned the game in its European birthplace. More importantly, lasting friendships developed that would survive long after the war ended and the prisoners returned home. For Heinrich, these encounters became the highlight of his captivity, moments of pure human connection that reminded him of who he had been before the war and who he might be again when it ended. The children never asked him about battles he had fought or why his country had started the war. They were interested only in his ability to make a soccer ball dance, in the stories he told about playing football in the streets of Munich, in the German words he taught them for various soccer techniques. The war officially ended in May of 1945, but it would be several more months before the prisoners at Camp Carson would be repatriated to Germany. During those final months, as Heinrich and his fellow prisoners awaited transport home, the soccer games continued. The children were older now, more skilled, but their enthusiasm for their German friends remained undiminished. When the day finally came for Heinrich to leave Colorado, Billy and several of the other children were there at the train station to say goodbye. It was an emotional scene, with tears on both sides, as friendships forged in the most unlikely circumstances faced an uncertain future. Billy, now taller and more serious, but still the same enthusiastic boy at heart, presented Heinrich with a going-away gift. It was a photograph, taken by Billy's father during one of their park soccer games, showing Heinrich in mid-demonstration of a ball-juggling trick while children watched with rapt attention. "So you won't forget us," Billy said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will never forget," Heinrich promised, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. Never. Heinrich returned to a Germany that was devastated by war, reduced to rubble in many places, and struggling to rebuild both its infrastructure and its national identity. He eventually found work as a youth soccer coach, dedicating himself to teaching children the sport he loved and the lessons about humanity he had learned in Colorado. He kept the photograph Billy had given him in a place of honor in his modest apartment, and he told the story of the American children who had seen past uniforms and nationalism to the simple humanity beneath crests. To his own players, many of whom were growing up in the difficult post-war years, he emphasized that sport could build bridges across any divide, that a soccer ball could speak languages that politicians never learned. Years later, when international mail service had been restored and the wounds of war had begun to heal, Heinrich received a letter postmarked from Colorado. It was from Billy, now a young man finishing high school, writing to thank his former prisoner of war friend for the lessons in soccer and humanity that had shaped his own approach to life. The correspondence continued for decades, with letters crossing the Atlantic to maintain a friendship that had begun in the most unlikely circumstances. Billy eventually became a teacher, inspired in part by Heinrich's patient coaching during those wartime soccer games. Heinrich continued his work with youth soccer, eventually becoming one of Germany's most respected coaches of young players. In 1974, nearly 30 years after their first meeting, Billy traveled to Germany to visit Heinrich. The reunion was emotional. Two men now in their 40s, embracing with the warmth of brothers, their friendship having survived decades and distance. Billy brought with him another gift, a new soccer ball, and challenged his old friend to demonstrate some of the tricks that had so captivated him as a child. Heinrich laughed, protesting that he was too old for such foolishness, but eventually gave in to Billy's playful insistence. As he balanced the ball on his neck, just as he had done in that Colorado park so many years ago, Both men were transported back to that time when the simple act of playing soccer had proven that humanity could transcend the artificial boundaries of war. The story of Heinrich and Billy, of German prisoners and American children finding common ground on a makeshift soccer field, became something of a legend in both Greeley and in Heinrich's hometown in Bavaria. It was retold in schools and community centers, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, the capacity for connection and kindness endured. Heinrich often reflected on how different his life might have been if those children had reacted to him with the fear and hatred that war typically breeds. Instead, their simple invitation to play had opened his heart to the possibility that people could see beyond the uniforms and ideologies that separated them to the common humanity that united them. The soccer ball Billy had given him during that final visit eventually found its way to a place of honor in the youth center where Heinrich worked. Beneath it, he placed a small plaque with words in both German and English. Sport builds bridges that politics cannot destroy. When Heinrich passed away in 1995, his funeral was attended not only by hundreds of German friends and colleagues, but also by Billy, now a grandfather himself, who had flown from Colorado to pay his respects to the man who had taught him that enemies could become friends over the simple act of kicking a ball. In his eulogy, Billy spoke about the lesson Heinrich had inadvertently taught him as a child, that humanity was stronger than hatred, that connection was more powerful than division, and that sometimes the most important bridges between people were built not by diplomats or politicians, but by children with soccer balls and the wisdom to see people as people, regardless of the uniforms they wore. The ripple effects of that first soccer game in Greeley extended far beyond Heinrich and Billy's friendship. In the months that followed their initial encounter, word of the German prisoners playing with American children reached other POW camps across Colorado and beyond. Camp commanders, initially skeptical of such interactions, began to reconsider their policies as they witnessed the positive effects on both prisoners and local communities. Captain Robert Hayes, the commanding officer at Camp Carson, had initially been nervous about allowing the informal soccer games to continue. Military protocol dictated strict separation between prisoners and civilians, but the overwhelming positive response from the Greeley community had surprised him. Parents wrote letters to the camp praising the German soldiers for their kindness to their children. Local newspapers ran human interest stories about the unlikely friendships. And even some of the more skeptical residents began to see the prisoners as young men rather than faceless enemies. The captain found himself grappling with questions that weren't covered in his military training. How do you maintain security and discipline while acknowledging the humanity of those under your command? How do you balance the legitimate concerns of war with the equally legitimate desire for human connection and dignity? His solution was to formalize what had begun informally. Working with local school officials and parent groups, Captain Hayes established a structured program that would allow supervised recreational activities between select prisoners and community members. The soccer games became the cornerstone of this program, but other activities soon followed. Heinrich found himself at the center of these expanded interactions, his natural teaching ability and improving English making him an ideal ambassador for his fellow prisoners. Beyond soccer, he began helping with maintenance projects at local schools, working alongside American fathers and grandfathers who had initially viewed him with suspicion, but gradually came to appreciate his work ethic and gentle manner with their children. One particularly memorable project involved rebuilding the playground equipment at Billy's elementary school. The wooden swings and slides had deteriorated during the war years, with materials and labor scarce as resources were directed toward the war effort. When the school board learned that several of the German prisoners had carpentry and metalworking skills, they approached Captain Hayes about the possibility of having them assist with the reconstruction. Heinrich, whose father had been a cabinet maker in Munich, found himself working alongside Jim Morrison, Billy's father, who ran a small construction business in town. The two men, who should have been enemies, discovered they shared not only a love of working with their hands, but also a deep appreciation for craftsmanship and attention to detail. Their collaboration began awkwardly, with Jim uncertain about how to interact with someone who had recently been shooting at American soldiers, and Heinrich nervous about overstepping boundaries or saying something that might be misinterpreted. But as they worked together, Measuring and cutting lumber for new swing sets, their shared focus on the task at hand gradually broke down the artificial barriers between them. "You've got good hands," Jim observed one afternoon as he watched Heinrich carefully sand the edges of a wooden plank. "Your father teach you that?" Heinrich nodded, grateful for the acknowledgement of his skill. "Yes, he was, how you say, woodworker. Made furniture, cabinets. I learned since I was small boy." "What happened to him?" Jim asked, then immediately looked embarrassed by the personal nature of the question. Heinrich paused in his sanding, his expression growing distant. "Bombing. Dresden. February this year. My mother, too." The words came out quietly, matter-of-factly, but Jim could hear the pain beneath the careful control. Jim set down his own tools, the magnitude of what Heinrich had shared settling over him. Here was a young man who had lost everything, who was thousands of miles from home, with no way to even visit his parents' graves, working to build playground equipment for the children of his former enemies. "I'm sorry," Jim said simply, the inadequacy of the words hanging between them. "That must be. I can't even imagine." Heinrich resumed his sanding, the rhythmic motion seeming to provide comfort. "War takes many things," he said eventually. "But today, we build something for children. This is good, yes?" From that moment, their working relationship transformed into something approaching friendship. Jim began sharing stories about Billy's childhood, about the boy's endless energy and enthusiasm for sports. Heinrich reciprocated with tales of his sister Greta, describing her love of reading and her dream of becoming a teacher. As the playground project progressed, other community members became involved. Margaret Morrison, Billy's mother, organized a lunch program for the workers, both American and German. Local teenagers, initially curious about the foreign prisoners, began stopping by after school to watch the construction and occasionally help with simple tasks. One of these teenagers was a 17-year-old named David Chen, whose older brother was serving in the Pacific Theater. David had initially been hostile toward the German prisoners, viewing them as representatives of the regime that had allied with Japan and was responsible for the war that had taken his brother away from home. But as he watched Heinrich work patiently with the younger children, teaching them basic woodworking skills and ensuring their safety around the tools, his perspective began to shift. "Why are you being so nice to us?" David asked Heinrich one afternoon, the question emerging from weeks of internal struggle. "We're enemies, aren't we?" Heinrich looked up from the saw bench where he was cutting supports for a new slide, considering the question carefully. "Are we enemies, David? You and me, right now, working to make place where children can play safely? But your country, my country, we're at war," David insisted, though his tone suggested he was questioning his own certainty. "Countries at war, yes," Heinrich agreed. "But you and me, we are just men. We both want children to be happy, to be safe. We both miss our families. We both hope war ends soon so we can go home." He gestured toward the half-completed playground. "This work we do together, this is not about countries. This is about children having place to play." David considered this, his young mind wrestling with concepts that many adults struggled to grasp. "My brother is fighting in the Pacific," he said eventually. "He's probably shooting at people just like you." "Maybe," Heinrich acknowledged. "And maybe Japanese boy, same age as you, is angry at me because his brother fights Americans in Europe. War makes everyone angry, everyone afraid. But anger and fear, they don't build playgrounds, they don't pass. Make children laugh." The conversation continued as they worked, Heinrich's patient responses gradually helping David understand that the human beings behind the uniforms were more complex than the simple categories of friend and enemy that war demanded. By the time the playground was completed, David had become one of Heinrich's most frequent visitors, often bringing homework assignments that required German translation. Using his interactions with Heinrich as an opportunity to learn about European history and culture from someone who had lived it. The playground dedication ceremony became a community event that drew hundreds of residents. Captain Hayes, recognizing the significance of what had been accomplished, allowed all the German prisoners who had worked on the project to attend. Local dignitaries spoke about the importance of community cooperation, but the most memorable moment came when Billy, representing all the school children, presented Heinrich with a hand-carved wooden plaque, thanking him and his fellow prisoners for their work. The plaque, created by Jim Morrison and inscribed by the school's art teacher, read, "To our friends from Germany, who helped build this playground where children of all nations could play together, thank you for showing us that kindness has no borders." Heinrich accepted the plaque with tears in his eyes, his English still imperfect, but his emotion unmistakable as he thanked the community for allowing him and his fellow prisoners to contribute something positive during their time of captivity. The ceremony concluded with an impromptu soccer game on the school's field, with children, parents, prisoners, and guards all participating in a joyful celebration of human connection. As autumn gave way to winter, the outdoor soccer games became less frequent, but the relationships that had been forged continued to develop through other activities. Heinrich began volunteering at the local library, helping to repair damaged books and teaching basic German to anyone interested in learning. His gentle manner and infinite patience made him particularly popular with elderly patrons who enjoyed hearing stories about European culture and history from someone who had experienced it firsthand. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the stern-faced woman who had initially objected to the children playing with German prisoners, became one of Heinrich's most unlikely supporters. Her own son had been killed in action in France, and her initial hostility toward the prisoners had been fueled by grief and a need for someone to blame. But as she watched Heinrich work with the library's collection of damaged books, carefully rebinding volumes with the same attention to detail he brought to carpentry, she began to see him as an individual rather than a symbol. Their first real conversation occurred on a snowy December afternoon when Mrs. Patterson found Heinrich alone in the library's back room, painstakingly repairing a children's book that had been damaged by water. The book was a collection of fairy tales, and Heinrich was working to save illustrations that showed children playing in settings that could have been anywhere in the world. "That's careful work," Mrs. Patterson observed, her tone neutral but not hostile. Heinrich looked up, recognizing the woman who had initially objected to the children's games. "Yes, ma'am. Children's books are important. Stories help children understand world is big, full of wonder." Mrs. Patterson picked up another damaged book from the pile, her fingers tracing the torn cover. "My son loved books when he was small. He would have been about your age now, if—" She let the sentence trail off. "I'm able to finish." Heinrich set down his tools, giving the woman his full attention. He had learned to recognize grief in all its forms during his months of captivity, had seen it in fellow prisoners who had lost friends and family, had felt it himself when news of his parents' death had reached him. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly. "War takes too many good people." Mrs. Patterson looked at him sharply, as if surprised by the genuine sympathy in his voice. "He was a good boy. Enlisted right after Pearl Harbor, wanted to do his duty." She paused, studying Heinrich's face. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Heinrich asked gently. "Monsters, I suppose. People who chose this war, who wanted it." She sat down heavily in one of the library chairs. "But you're just a boy yourself, aren't you? Probably drafted into service just like my Robert was." Heinrich nodded slowly. "I was 19 when war started. Thought it would be great adventure, chance to serve my country. I was very foolish." "We all were foolish," Mrs. Patterson said with a bitter laugh. "Sending our children off to kill each other while calling it noble." From that conversation grew an unlikely friendship between the grieving mother and the young prisoner who had shown such kindness to her community's children. Mrs. Patterson began visiting the library regularly when Heinrich was working there, bringing him books about American history and culture, while listening to his stories about life in Bavaria before the war. Through Mrs. Patterson, Heinrich learned about the American families who had sacrificed for the war effort, about mothers who had sent multiple sons to fight, about communities that had rationed food and fuel while supporting war bond drives. He began to understand that the Americans, like his own people, were ordinary individuals caught up in events far beyond their control, trying to do what they believed was right, while paying terrible personal costs. Mrs. Patterson, in turn, learned about the German civilians who had suffered through years of bombing, about young men like Heinrich, who had been drafted into a war they neither started nor particularly wanted to fight, about families torn apart by ideology and circumstances. Her black and white view of the conflict, where Americans were purely good and Germans purely evil, gave way to a more nuanced understanding of war's complexity. Their friendship became a bridge between Heinrich and other community members who had initially been skeptical of the prisoner program. Mrs. Patterson's endorsement carried weight in Greeley's social circles, and her public support for Heinrich and his fellow prisoners helped shift community opinion even further toward acceptance and friendship. Winter also brought opportunities for different kinds of cultural exchange. Heinrich and several other prisoners were invited to share their celebration of Christmas with local families, teaching them German carols and traditional holiday customs, while learning about American traditions in Das Return. The blending of customs, with German prisoners singing O Tannenbaum, while American children performed Jingle Bells, created moments of beauty that transcended national boundaries. Billy's family invited Heinrich to spend Christmas Eve with them, an invitation that required special permission from Captain Hayes, but was granted in recognition of the positive impact the prisoner program was having on Burr. Community relations. Heinrich arrived at the Morrison home carrying gifts he had carved himself, wooden toys for Billy and his younger sister, and a small jewelry box for Margaret Morrison as thanks for her kindness. The evening was both wonderful and bittersweet for Heinrich, the warmth of family life highlighting his separation from his own loved ones, while simultaneously providing comfort and connection. Billy proudly showed off his improved soccer skills in the backyard, even in the snow, while Heinrich helped Margaret prepare traditional German Christmas cookies, sharing recipes his mother had taught him. As midnight approached and Christmas Day began, Heinrich found himself standing at the Morrison family's window, looking out at the snow-covered Colorado landscape and thinking about home. Billy appeared beside him, still excited from the evening's festivities, but sensitive enough to recognize his friend's melancholy. "Are you sad because you miss your family?" Billy asked with the directness that only children possess. Heinrich nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he spoke. "I think they miss you too," Billy said confidently. "And I bet they're proud of you for being so nice to us, even though we're supposed to be enemies." The simple wisdom of the child's observation broke through Heinrich's emotional defenses, and he found himself crying for the first time since learning of his parents' death. Billy, understanding intuitively that his friend needed comfort, simply stayed beside him at the window, his small presence a reminder that even in loss and separation, human connection could provide healing. Spring of 1945 brought news that the war in Europe was nearing its end, information that created mixed emotions among both the prisoners and their American friends. For the Germans, the approaching conclusion of the conflict promised eventual return home, but it also meant leaving behind relationships that had become precious to them. For the Americans who had befriended the prisoners, the end of the war meant saying goodbye to young men who had become integral parts of their community. Heinrich found himself torn between joy at the prospect of freedom and grief at the thought of leaving Colorado. The life he had built here, circumscribed though it was by the realities of captivity, had provided him with purpose and friendship during the darkest period of his existence. The thought of returning to a devastated Germany, to a homeland where his parents were gone and his future uncertain, filled him with anxiety even as he longed for true freedom. The official end of the war in Europe came on May 8, 1945, the day that should have been purely celebratory for the German prisoners, but was instead tinged with complexity. Heinrich and his fellow prisoners gathered around the radio in their barracks, listening to the announcement that their country had surrendered unconditionally. The silence that followed was profound, each man grappling with his own mixture of relief, grief, and uncertainty. Franz Müller was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled. "It's over," he said simply. "Yes," Heinrich replied, but the word carried little of the joy that might have been expected. Klaus Weber, the farmer from the Rhineland, voiced what many of them were thinking. "What do we go home to? Our farms destroyed? Our families scattered or dead? Our country occupied by foreign armies? It was Hermann Bach, the former philosophy professor, who provided perspective. We go home to the possibility of rebuilding, he said quietly. We go home to the chance to create something better than what came before. We go home carrying the lessons we've learned here about how former enemies can become friends. The conversation continued late into the night, with the prisoners sharing their fears and hopes for the future. Many spoke about their desire to maintain contact with the American friends they had made, to find ways to bridge the gap between their two countries in peacetime as they had bridged the gap between individuals during war. Heinrich thought about Billy and the Morrison family, about Mrs. Patterson and her journey, from grief to friendship, about David Chen and his evolution from hostility to understanding. These relationships had shown him that the hatred and suspicion between nations need not be permanent, that individuals could choose connection over division regardless of the political circumstances that surrounded them. As spring turned to summer, the prisoners at Camp Carson began the long process of preparing for repatriation. Medical examinations, paperwork, interviews with various officials, all the bureaucratic machinery of moving thousands of men across an ocean and back to their homeland. But even as these preparations continued, the relationships between prisoners and community members deepened rather than diminished. Heinrich's work at the library expanded to include helping with a community oral history project, recording the stories of elderly residents about Greeley's early days as a frontier town. His patience and genuine interest in people's stories made him an ideal interviewer. And many of the town's senior citizens found themselves sharing memories with this young German that they had never told their own grandchildren. Through these interviews, Heinrich learned about American pioneer spirit, about the challenges faced by immigrants who had come to Colorado seeking better lives, about communities that had been built through cooperation and mutual support despite differences in background and belief. These stories resonated with his own hopes for Germany's future, suggesting that devastated societies could indeed rebuild themselves if their people were willing to work together. One particularly moving interview was with Jonas Andersson, an elderly Swedish immigrant who had arrived in Colorado in the 1890s as a young man seeking farmland. Jonas had faced discrimination and suspicion as a foreigner, had struggled with the English language and unfamiliar customs, but had eventually become one of Greeley's most respected citizens. The secret, Jonas told Heinrich during their recorded conversation, is to never let other people's fear become your own. You show them who you are through your actions, day after day, until they see the person instead of the stranger. Heinrich recognized the wisdom in these words, understanding that they applied not only to his current situation, but to the challenges he would face when he returned to Germany. He would be coming home as a former prisoner of war, marked by defeat and carrying stories of friendship with former enemies that some of his countrymen might view with suspicion. As the summer progressed, it became clear that repatriation would not happen immediately. The logistics of moving hundreds of thousands of prisoners across a war-torn Europe were staggering, and priority was being given to prisoners who had been held longest and those with urgent family situations. Heinrich and his fellow prisoners settled into what they knew would be their final months in Colorado. Determined to make the most of their remaining time, the soccer games with the children continued throughout the summer, but they took on a bittersweet quality as everyone involved knew they were numbered. Billy, now 11 and significantly taller than when Heinrich had first met him, had become skilled enough to challenge his German friend in one-on-one competitions. Though Heinrich usually managed to maintain his advantage through experience and technique, during one particularly memorable game in late July, Billy managed to score a goal against Heinrich, using a move the German had taught him months earlier. The boy's celebration was so exuberant, his joy so pure, that Heinrich found himself laughing harder than he had in years. Despite being the victim of his own teaching success. "I got you!" Billy shouted, dancing around the makeshift goal they had constructed from old wooden crates. "I used your own trick against you." "Yes, you did," Heinrich agreed, still chuckling. "Student becomes teacher, teacher becomes student. This is how it should be." Margaret Morrison, who had been watching from the sidelines, approached Heinrich as the game wound down. "You've given him something special," she said quietly. "Not just soccer skills, but confidence, kindness, the understanding that people are more alike than different." Heinrich shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "He gave me much more. All of you did. You showed me that hatred is choice, not destiny." As autumn arrived, and the leaves began to change in the cottonwood trees that lined Greeley's streets, Heinrich received word that his repatriation group would be departing in November. The news spread quickly through his network of American friends, generating a flurry of farewell activities and gift-giving that both touched and overwhelmed him. The library staff organized a small ceremony to thank Heinrich for his volunteer work, presenting him with a carefully selected collection of books about American history and culture to take home with him. Mrs. Patterson contributed a leather-bound journal, inscribed with the words, "For recording new stories in your homeland." Billy's class at school created a scrapbook filled with drawings, photographs, and letters from his months in Colorado. Each child had contributed something, from crayon drawings of soccer games to carefully practiced letters in both English and the broken German that Heinrich had taught them. David Chen, now a high school senior, presented Heinrich with a hand-drawn map of Colorado, marked with all the locations where they had worked together and spent time. "So you can show people back home where you learned that Americans aren't all bad," David said with a grin that took the sting out of his words. The gifts were wonderful, but it was the relationships themselves that Heinrich treasured most. As his departure date approached, he found himself trying to memorize everything. The way Billy's face scrunched up in concentration when attempting a difficult soccer move, Margaret Morrison's laugh when she told stories about her son's latest adventure, Mrs. Patterson's gradual smile when she shared memories of her deceased son, David Chen's earnest questions about European history and culture. The final soccer game took place on a crisp October afternoon, with golden leaves swirling around the makeshift field in the city park. Word had spread throughout the community, and a larger crowd than usual had gathered to watch and participate. Children and adults, prisoners and guards, longtime residents and recent arrivals, all came together for one last celebration of the friendships that had grown from the most unlikely circumstances. Heinrich played with particular intensity that day, as if trying to store up every sensation for the long journey ahead. The feel of the ball against his feet, the satisfying thud when he made solid contact, the cheers and laughter of children who had never learned to see him as anything other than a friend who happened to be very good at soccer. As the game wound down and shadows began to lengthen across the field, Billy approached Heinrich with a serious expression that was unusual for the normally exuberant boy. "Will you remember us?" Billy asked, his voice small with uncertainty. Heinrich knelt down to bring himself to the boy's eye level, his hands resting gently on Billy's shoulders. "Billy Morrison," he said solemnly, "I will remember you every day, my life. When I am old man with grandchildren, I will tell them about brave American boy who saw German prisoner and asked him to play soccer instead of throwing stones." Billy nodded, seeming satisfied with this promise, then threw his arms around Heinrich in a fierce hug that conveyed everything words could not express. Other children followed suit, creating a group embrace that included several of Heinrich's fellow prisoners and even some of the American adults who had gathered to watch. The moment stretched on, nobody wanting to be the first to break the connection, until finally Captain Hayes gently announced that it was time for the prisoners to return to camp. The goodbyes that followed were emotional but not final, everyone understanding that there would be more opportunities to visit before Heinrich's departure. The last few weeks of Heinrich's time in Colorado passed in a blur of farewell visits and final preparations. He spent an afternoon with Jim Morrison, learning advanced woodworking techniques to take home with him. An evening with Mrs. Patterson, sharing stories about their respective homelands, and countless hours with Billy and the other children, teaching them German words and trying to memorize their faces. On his final night in Greeley, Heinrich was granted permission for one last dinner with the Morrison family. The meal was both celebration and wake, filled with laughter and tears, as everyone tried to make the most of their remaining time together while avoiding the reality of impending separation. After dinner, as Heinrich prepared to return to camp for the last time, Billy presented him with one final gift. It was a small wooden cross, hand-carved by the boy himself, with tools his father had given him. The craftsmanship was rough, but earnest, the love behind it unmistakable. "For protection," Billy explained simply. "So you'll always have something from us with you." Heinrich accepted the cross, with hands that trembled slightly, overwhelmed by the generosity of spirit displayed by this child and his family. "Thank you," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "I will treasure this always." The train departure the next morning was a community event, with dozens of Greeley residents gathering at the station to see Heinrich and his fellow prisoners off. Signs and banners expressed gratitude for their contributions to the community, and many people brought small gifts of food and books for the long journey ahead. Billy was there, of course, along with his parents and sister. Mrs. Patterson stood nearby, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. David Chen had taken time off from school to attend, and even Jonas Anderson, the elderly Swedish immigrant, had made the effort to come despite his advancing age. As Heinrich boarded the train that would take him to a port city for the ocean crossing to Europe, he turned back one last time to wave to the assembled crowd. Billy had climbed onto his father's shoulders to get a better view, and he waved both hands frantically while calling out, "Don't forget us, Henry! Don't forget!" "Never!" Heinrich called back, his voice carrying across the platform. "Never!" The train pulled away from Greeley with Heinrich pressed against the window, watching the Colorado landscape scroll past for the final time. The mountains he had first seen, as a frightened prisoner of war, now seemed like old friends, bidding him farewell, their snow-capped peaks catching the morning light in a display of natural beauty that he would carry in his memory forever. As the train gathered speed and Greeley disappeared behind them, Heinrich settled back in his seat and pulled out the journal Mrs. Patterson had given him. On the first page, he began to write, "My name is Heinrich Krüger, and I have just left the most important place in my life, not because it was where I was born, or where I grew up, or where I fought in a war, but because it was where I learned that enemies are only enemies until they choose to be something else. Today I go home to Germany to help build a future based on the lessons I learned from American children who taught me that a soccer ball can bridge any divide that hatred tries to create." End quote. The story endures as a testament to the power of simple human kindness, proof that even in the midst of humanity's greatest conflicts, the capacity for connection and understanding survives. It reminds us that the divisions we create between ourselves are often far less significant than the common threads that bind us together, and that sometimes it takes the uncomplicated wisdom of children to help adults remember what really matters. Heinrich Krüger had expected stones and hatred when he walked past that Colorado schoolyard in 1944. Instead, he found children with a soccer ball and hearts large enough to see past everything that was supposed to make them enemies. That single game, lasting just an hour on a spring afternoon, became the foundation for a lifetime of friendship and a reminder that humanity's greatest victories are often its smallest, most personal moments of connection across the divides that war creates, but love can overcome.